to make me blush. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces back, and happy Memorial Day weekend. It was very nice to see that the clouds parted and it's blue sky for today. But welcome to week one of this year's Chautauqua Lecture Series. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for today, we are fortunate that William Robinson has joined us for Images and Historic Paintings Week to share his expertise on Vincent van Gogh. Dr. Robinson has a strong connection to paintings from his experience growing up in France. He is the former senior curator of modern European art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, having worked his way up from museum fellow to curatorial assistant, assistant curator, and eventually to full curator and department head. This morning's session is Vincent van Gogh and Madness, the artist versus the legend. This presentation asks the questions: what do medical studies tell us about Vincent van Gogh's medical condition? Do books and films offer new insights into the artist, or do they present a distorted popular opinion of his life and achievements? As a reminder, I do ask if everyone would please mute your cell phone ringers, and please help me in welcoming William Robinson.
Is this on? Hello? Okay, the mic is on. Oh, so thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here. I have to tell you, I love Lakeside. This is a great place, and I'm happy you're here. It's great. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and then open the floor to questions and comments. I'm going to assume that people here know something about Vincent van Gogh, right? I mean, who doesn't? So I'm sure you know, he is widely regarded as one of the greatest painters in the history of art. He's also been the subject of countless popular books, songs, and movies. Nearly everyone knows that he cut off his left ear in a psychotic attack, and he spent nearly a year in a mental institution. You probably also know that he had a very, very short artistic career. He only decided to become a painter at age 27, didn't really get going for about 5 years, and then after little formal training, committed suicide at age 37. So we know that he suffered from mental issues, but was he really mad, as some suggest? And if that's true, how did it affect his art? So what I'm going to talk about today is popular perceptions of Van Gogh and questions of whether studies of his paintings can tell us anything about his mental condition. So we're going to have a new look at his art too, how and why he produced it. Oops, I did the wrong button. There we go. Let's begin with a quick overview of Van Gogh's life. He was born in Zundert, a small town in the southern Netherlands, and on the right you're looking at the house where he was born. His father, Theodorus, was a Protestant minister. 3 of his uncles were art dealers. You can see here that he was the eldest of 6 children, so Vincent is on the left. And then you have Anna, Theo, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina, and Cornelius. There is significant evidence of mental illness in his family. And here's a psychiatric chart. I once did a symposium with a director of psychiatry at the Cleveland Clinic about Van Gogh and artists' mental issues. And based upon this book, Touched by Fire, that deals with creative artists and the relationship with mental disorders. So anyway, he actually did this psychiatric chart. It indicates, if you look above there are the parents, Vincent with the X means suicide. Then Anna, Theo, who also had bipolar disorder, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina, and Cornelius, who also committed suicide on the right. And then Wilhelmina, next to her, she spent more than 30 years in a mental institution. So 2 pictures of Van Gogh and his brother Theo. Vincent was melancholic as a child, but he was very bright. In fact, he was brilliant. He spoke fluently 3 languages, Dutch, French, and English. He left school at age 16 to work with his uncle at the art firm of Goupil and Company in The Hague. This was an international company headquartered in Paris, but he worked at the local branch in the Netherlands at first. After several years, Vincent's brother Theo joined the firm. In 1873, Vincent was transferred to the London branch of Goupil. 2 years later, he was transferred to the Paris branch, where he became increasingly angry with fellow employees for treating art merely as a commodity. After he had repeated quarrels with the managers, he was fired in 1875. In 1876, Vincent returned to England to work as a school teacher, and he became increasingly drawn to religion. So he decided to become a minister like his father, and he returned to the Netherlands in 1877 to begin formal studies, but he failed the entrance exams into the theology department at the University of Amsterdam. However, the Dutch Reformed Church offered Vincent a position ministering to the poor coal miners in Belgium. Once there, he expressed his solidarity with the miners by giving his very comfortable lodgings to a homeless person, and he moved into a tiny hut where he slept on straw. When church authorities saw this, they were appalled, and they dismissed him for insulting the dignity of the priesthood. It was while sketching the poor miners in Belgium that Vincent, now aged 27, finally discovered his true calling and decided to become an artist. In October 1888, he moved to Brussels and studied just for a brief time at the Royal Academy of Arts, mostly taking life drawing lessons. For nearly 6 years, he spent his time in the Netherlands teaching himself to draw. In 1882, he began living with a former prostitute named Sienne Hornick, who became his lover and model. Despite very strong disapproval from Theo and the family, Vincent supported Sienne and her 2 children for 2 years before finally he responded to the pressure from his brother and left Sienne. This is his most important painting of this early period in the Netherlands. It's called The Potato Eaters, painted in 1885. And it's a painting in which he conveyed his sympathies for the daily struggles of poor country people who he wrote had earned an honest living by eating the food they grow. The important thing to know is that this is not meant to be a realistic portrayal of peasants. Vincent was focused on the expressive meaning of the subject, and he said that he painted the figures the color of a dusty, unpeeled potato. In 1866, Vincent moved to Paris, and you'll see a big change, obviously, and he spent 2 years living there with his brother Theo, who is now employed at the Paris branch of Goupil and Company. While in Paris, Vincent became close friends with many of the most important artists of the period, including Claude Monet and Toulouse-Lautrec. During this period, as you can see, Vincent began using more intense pure colors, and obviously this is related to the Impressionist works he was seeing there. After 2 years in Paris, Vincent, he's now aged 35, moved to the south of France and began living in what he called the Yellow House in Arles. He was dazzled by the intense light and colors of the south, and he invited other painters from Paris to join him, hoping to establish an artist colony there. Now, Vincent painted many of his greatest works during this period, including the artist's bedroom at Arles and the Sunflower series. So there was only one artist who accepted Vincent's invitation to come. In October 1888, Paul Gauguin arrived and spent 3 months living and working with Vincent. They had intense arguments, culminating in an event in late December when Vincent, while having a psychotic attack accompanied by auditory and visual hallucinations, cut off his left ear and gave it to a prostitute as a gift. After a brief hospitalization in Arles, Vincent voluntarily interned himself in a mental asylum in nearby Saint-Remy. He wrote to his brother Theo in January, quote, "The unbearable hallucinations have stopped for now, reducing themselves to a simple nightmare on account of taking potassium bromide." Unfortunately, the calm would not last. Vincent continued to suffer intermittent psychiatric breakdowns accompanied by hallucinations. It was while he was interned at the asylum that while he was interned there, he was allowed to paint both in his room and eventually on walks through the nearby countryside and villages, but always accompanied by a guard. He painted Starry Night, a scene observing the night sky viewed through his window just before dawn. And the red arrow in the painting on the left shows you the window that Vincent was looking through at the landscape beyond. After being discharged from the asylum in May 1890, Vincent spent the last 70 days of his life living in Auvers, a small town, an artist colony 15 miles north of Paris. He rented a room there at a small inn, and continued painting under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet. And there you see Vincent's room in the inn. On Sunday, July 27th, 1890, Vincent went out to paint in the fields, and he tried to commit suicide by shooting himself with a revolver. The bullet lodged just above the stomach, but he managed to walk back to his room and died 2 years later with Theo by his side. Now, the exact reasons for his suicide remain unclear, but his letters indicate that he felt guilty for being a financial burden to his brother. And he told a friend, quote, "I could not stick it out any longer, so I'll shoot myself." That November, his brother Theo, now suffering from grief and overwork and dementia, was committed to a psychiatric hospital. Theo died in January and was buried in a simple grave next to Vincent's. So you see the two graves down below, and that's Vincent's bedroom above. And on the left is a sketch done by Paul Gachet of Vincent on his deathbed. Vincent's reputation as the long-suffering, mentally deranged artist began to grow within a decade after his death, due partly to the publication of his letters and Paul Gauguin's account of the ear-cutting incident. So more about that in a few minutes. For now, let's ask ourselves whether popular books, movies, and songs such as Don McLean's Starry, Starry Night have helped or hindered our understanding of the artist. Personally, I love the song, but I have some issues with the books. In 2011, Stephen Neff and Gregory White Smith published a new, highly publicized biography of the artist. The authors were everywhere: 60 Minutes, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Larry King, even Oprah. So I read their book, and I was appalled. It's not that this massive tome is not thoroughly researched, it is. What bothers me are statements like this: "He did everything with the urgent, blinding, simple-mindedness of a child." I'm especially troubled by the repeated descriptions of Van Gogh as a manic, paranoid artist who persistently worked in a state of uncontrolled emotional frenzy. Neff and Smith constructed an astonishingly simple-minded contrast between Van Gogh and Gauguin, and here are just a few examples. Vincent wanted to paint, whereas Gauguin wanted to draw. Now, this statement might lead you to think that some drawing was something forward to Van Gogh. Have you ever seen his drawings? They're the most exquisite things in the world. And here's more from the biography. Vincent championed spontaneity and serendipity, whereas Gauguin constructed his image slowly and methodically. You'll also find this gem, maybe my favorite in the biography. Quote, "Vincent flung himself at the canvas, headlong, with a loaded brush and fierce intent, whereas Gauguin built up his surfaces in tranquil sessions of careful strokes." And one more. Vincent reworked his strokes, reshaping the impasto again and again before the paint even began to set. I like to try to picture Vincent throwing himself at the canvas. So you may be wondering at this point, why don't I give Smith and Neff a mulligan since they are lawyers? They're not conservators, curators, or doctors with any expertise in a psychiatric disease. And the answer is I can't let this pass, because I'm deeply troubled by the realization that this is the Van Gogh that a lot of the public knows. So for over a century, writers, booksellers, and filmmakers have cashed in on the sensationalized cliches of Van Gogh's, focusing excessively on his mental illness, the incident of slicing off the ear, and all the rest, rather than looking closely at his working methods and consulting experts in his mental condition. My own view of Van Gogh emerged after becoming engaged in a research project with a team of curators and conservators devoted to studying his paintings in museums and conservation labs throughout the US and Europe. Now, you may recognize some of the conservators that I was working with in these photos because they're members of your community here. On the left is Marcia Steele. That's Elizabeth Steele from the Phillips collection in the middle. And then there's Marcia, Rustin Levinson, and Rustin's daughter, Geddes. And do you know where we are? We are in the Musée d'Orsay, Paris, doing our exams. On a day when the Orsay was closed, they allowed us to come in. We brought in technical equipment and did exams of their paintings. Our fascination with Van Gogh's working methods was initially sparked by interest in the painting on the left in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and its relationship to a very closely related painting on the right in the Phillips collection. Now, what's amazing about these paintings is not only do they look the same, but they're exactly the same size. So we were kind of astonished and wondered what's going on here. What we learned is that this was not an unusual occurrence in Van Gogh's art, as he often painted multiple versions of the same subject. And here are a few examples. The 3 versions of the bedroom, 5 versions of the Postman Roulin, and 5 versions of the sunflowers. So we found the answer to why Vincent painted multiple versions of a subject in his letters. He described the painting on the left in Cleveland as a, quote, study from nature, and the one on the right in Washington as a repetition. So it became clear that he had a practice of painting a first version of a subject while working before the motif, that is often out in nature, and then using that version to paint a second version in the studio. And it occurred to me that what people often mistake in reading Vincent's letters is when he says study from nature, they think he's making a pencil sketch. No, he's making a full-blown painting and then using it to make a second version in the studio. So this set us out on a project to study the so-called repetitions and to try to figure out in these series which work was painted first and which came later. And that led us to organize an exhibition called Van Gogh Repetitions, which was shown in Cleveland and at the Phillips Collection in Washington in 2014. Understanding Van Gogh's use of this term repetition provided crucial insights into the artist and his working methods. So his first recorded usage of this term appears in a letter in 1888, in which he refers to the painting on the left as a study from nature and the one on the right as a repetition. Comparing the two is instructive because it indicates that a repetition is not an exact duplicate of the study from life. And I'm not sure you can see this in the slide, but in the painting on the right, the studio version, it's more carefully painted, there are more trees, and Vincent wrote about that painting in his letters that he had transformed the subject into a symphony in white. So he's reinventing the subject, trying to improve the aesthetics. Now it's equally important to know that Van Gogh also used the word copy in his letters, but he distinguished it from a repetition. By a copy, he meant an exact duplicate of something, whereas a repetition can be better understood as a second version or a variation. Examination of the 3 paintings of the artist's bedroom were especially instructive. We identified the painting in the upper left in Chicago as the first version painted from life. Oh, sorry, that's one's in the Van Gogh Museum. And the other versions as the repetitions that he painted a year later in the asylum. Comparing X-radiographs, or images taken with X-rays of the paintings, also proved highly instructive. You can see that the first version on the left, the one done in his bedroom at Arles, was painted with extremely broad or wide brushstrokes, often in random disorganized patterns, suggesting that it was painted quickly. By contrast, the brushstrokes in the repetition on the right are thinner, more delicate, and applied in long decorative patterns. I have a few details that may be helpful. I mean, look, for example, this is a really good, look at the way this part of the sheet is painted as opposed to the brushstrokes in this. I hope it's not too pixelated, but it's just small and delicate and very carefully done. These X-rays provide an excellent example of how Vincent often painted a first version with great speed and used the study from life to make a more carefully constructed repetition in the studio. Van Gogh's 2 versions of the Arlésienne provide another opportunity for studying the differences between a study from life and a repetition. Vincent told his brother that he painted the work on the left. He said he slashed it out in 45 minutes. If you look closely, you can see that he painted the first version with incredible speed, quickly covering the background with a pattern basket weave brush strokes, often leaving, and it's on jute, which is a very rough canvas, leaving it visible. He took an entirely different approach with the work on the right, painting it much more slowly. He also idealized Marie's features in the repetition, thereby transforming his life portrait into a symbolic image that pays homage to the legendary beauty of the women of Arles. And here's a really good example in this detail. Look at the work on the left. That's the first version, and look at how more carefully and delicately painted the second version is on the right. In late 1888, Van Gogh painted 2 portraits of the postman's wife Augustine Rouland, one including her newborn daughter. In the second painting on the right, and we believe that the one on the right was actually derived from the one on the left, absent the baby and a few other changes. And what you're seeing in the painting on the right is a painting called La Berceuse, which in French means it's a woman who's rocking a cradle. You see Augustine sort of sitting there holding this rope, rocking an unseen cradle. Van Gogh may have derived the subject from this painting by William Bouguereau, also called La Berceuse, except for the baby's omitted. And the answer is why? The answer is because guess what? We're the baby. We're sitting right below Augustine in the cradle, and she's holding the rope that's rocking us. What's more, this title, La Berceuse, also means lullaby in French. So what she's doing, she's humming a lullaby as she's rocking us in the cradle. Now, Vincent painted 5 versions of this subject, and he wanted them installed on ships above the sailors, resting in their hammocks so they could feel comforted as the ship was rocking back and forth. You know, my guess is, though, that this is probably not the type of female images most sailors hang above their hammocks. Now, again, comparing the x-rays of Augustine's head in the paintings indicates that the painting on the left, produced from life, was done much more quickly than the work on the right. And again, let me show you, the details are really very helpful here. And just kind of look at the way the hair's done in this figure with these very small, delicate strokes as opposed to this very, you can almost see the width of his brush strokes, which are incredible. The most important thing that we learned from our examinations is that Van Gogh's practice of painting carefully constructed repetitions in the studio contradicts the cliched view of the artist as a madman, always slashing wildly at his canvas in an explosion of overheated emotion. These studies provided an invaluable counterpoint to the biographers who seem irresistibly drawn to a sensationalized view of Van Gogh as a mad or insane artist who worked with the blind fury of an idiot savant. So let me return for a minute to the question of how this view of Van Gogh came to be and why is it so pervasive. Rumors about Vincent's mental condition and ear-cutting incident began circulating among fellow artists in Paris almost immediately after the incident occurred in December 1888. However, for a short time, Vincent remained largely known to the public by an article written by Albert Aurier, written in the Mercure de France, published in 1890. It focused on Van Gogh's art rather than his illness. Aurier opened a window of understanding into his shocking distortions of distorted form and color. So Aurier wrote, quote, "What characterizes his work as a whole is its strength of excess, its nervousness, its violence of expression." Aurier continues, I love this, "He is a fanatic, an enemy of bourgeois society and pettiness, a kind of drunken giant, a brain at the boiling point, pouring down all its lava, unchecked into all the ravines of art, a terrible, saddened genius, often sublime, always near the brink of the pathological." Now, notice that he does not say Vincent was mad. He said he was near the brink. What he's doing, this poet, is he's situating Van Gogh within a romantic trope of the doomed or the ill-fated artist, gifted with unusual powers of insights. So he's a tragic creative figure who suffers from mental and physical conditions due to his otherness and acute sensitivity to the broader forces at work in an indifferent universe. It's important to observe that by madness, writers of this generation did not mean clinical insanity. These are people that they saw as being unable to reconcile with mainstream society. They were aberrant personalities by conventional standards, and for whom the designation madness served as a badge of honor, because it situated them outside society and a culture that they rejected as corrupt, debased, and diseased. Aurier praised Van Gogh for responding to this situation by creating a new world of visionary images, and ascribed to him the same madness of creative fire that critics assigned to poets of the period like Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and Edgar Allan Poe. While Aurier was writing about Van Gogh as an artist, perhaps no one was more responsible for sensationalizing the tragedy of his personal life than his friend Paul Gauguin. In 1903, the Mercure de France published excerpts from Gauguin's book Avant et Après, a self-serving account of the time he spent with Van Gogh and Arles. In this skewed account, Gauguin credited himself with enlightening and providing Van Gogh with the path for making progress. Gauguin also declared that both Van Gogh brothers were mad before launching into the story of how Vincent had sliced off an ear, carefully washed it, placed it in an envelope, then handed it into a prostitute in a cafe, saying, "Keep this in remembrance of me." So it's really Gauguin who's the source of this story. Whether completely true or not, it has gripped the public ever since. The publication of Van Gogh's letters only stoked the fire. Between 1893 and 1913, excerpts from his letters appeared in literary reviews, popular magazines, and books, including publications in Dutch, English, French, German, and Russian. In 1914, Theo's widow, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, published an authoritative volume of more than 600 letters. And by the way, the letters are extraordinary. If you want to know anything about who this person was, read the letter. He was brilliant. And you can find those letters online on the website of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. The first biographical novel about Van Gogh, Margaret Irwin's How Many Miles to Babylon, appeared in 1913. That's only 13 years after the artist's death. The Van Gogh frenzy reached new heights with the publication of Irving Stone's blockbuster novel, A Lust for Life, released in multiple editions between 1935 and 1939. Stone's novel would be translated into more than 39 languages and adapted into the popular film, I think most of us have seen, starring Kirk Douglas in 1956. But I have to ask the question, what has the public learned about Van Gogh's art from this media circus? One of the most persistent messages is that Van Gogh always worked frantically and impulsively, as if barely able to control himself. And again, where does this come from? Mostly from Gauguin, who attempted to enhance his own reputation by belittling Van Gogh as a hopelessly naive, undisciplined, anti-intellectual artist driven by near animalistic instinct, which is entirely at odds with the complex, intelligent artist we find in the letters and in his paintings. As an artist, Van Gogh worked tirelessly to refine his compositions, not just to improve them aesthetically, but to deepen their emotional resonance and intellectual meaning. He painted 3 versions of the Potato Eaters and wrote that the final version was created largely from memory and imagination. He wrote in a letter to Theo at the time, quote, "I let my own head do the work in the sense of idea or imagination, which isn't so much the case with studies where no creative process may take place." Vincent also has expressed his admiration for Rembrandt by noting how the Dutch artist transformed nature into a higher reality. You see a Rembrandt in the lower left. Vincent wrote, quote, "Rembrandt dreams and dreams and his brush begins to flow in his portrait, but from memory. Its expression becomes sadder and more and deeper. I'm describing a painter who paints and dreams from the imagination." So people who cling to this more limited view of Van Gogh should take note that from his earliest years until his final months in Auvers, he assiduously worked at improving his compositions by careful study, adjustment, and repetition. His sister Elizabeth wrote of his studio at the time he was painting the Potato Eaters, quote, "Several canvases stood against the wall. He was always working on more than one at a time." 3 years later, while living in Arles, Vincent wrote to Theo why he worked on multiple canvases at the same time. This is a quote. "At the same time, I have something like an exhibition at my place, in the sense that I've taken all the studies off the stretching frames and have nailed them to the wall to finish drying. It will come to the same thing as if I've studied them more and more and longer, because to do a subject over and over again amounts in short to the same sort of seriousness." Now, with all due respect to Kirk Douglas, this is a more accurate image of Van Gogh as an artist than the character of him standing in a field, slashing wildly at his canvas as the wind knocks him about before he loses his mind, swallows his paints, and then washes them down with turpentine. Now, unfortunately for those who would prefer a more balanced view of the artist, this caricature has served as a goldmine for authors and filmmakers deeply invested in perpetuating this notion that Van Gogh is mad. In 1906, the art historian Julius Meyer Graf, an author of one of the most influential early Van Gogh biographies, wrote that Vincent was, quote, "insane," when he created his most significant paintings in the mental hospital in Arles. I note the word insane. In 1922, the German psychiatrist Dr. Karl Jaspers asserted that Van Gogh suffered from schizophrenia and a severe mental condition that affected his paintings from 1888 onward. In 1928, two French doctors published excerpts of Van Gogh medical records, which they got access to, and they published in a book titled The Madness of Van Gogh. It's important to note, though, that according to Vincent's doctor, they thought he wasn't mad. They thought he suffered from a form of epilepsy aggravated by excessive consumption of alcohol and coffee. Moreover, they identified Van Gogh's mental disorder as temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition associated with intermittent brain seizures during which the front of the brain becomes overwhelmed by a storm of abnormal activity which can cause auditory and visual hallucinations. Medical studies of Van Gogh have continued to grow at an astonishing pace. And when we were working on this show, I was getting letters from all kinds of doctors who wanted to contribute to our catalog, including the man in the lower right, Dr. Wilfred Arnold from the University of Kansas Medical Center. He's got a very strange theory about Van Gogh that I think nobody agrees with. I mean, it does seem clear that while Van Gogh suffered from a combination of physical and psychiatric disorders, he certainly was not mad or insane, or at least not as clinically defined, because he remained lucid and creative between psychiatric attacks. Van Gogh wrote in a letter in March 1889, quote, this is 3 months after mutilating his ear. This is writing to Theo, quote, I write to you in full possession and presence of mind, not as a man, but as the brother you know. I think that this conclusion was confirmed by our research on the repetitions. What we learned by studying Van Gogh's art is that his practice of painting repetitions was far more extensive and vital to his creative process than many people realize. Second, contrary to the deeply ingrained perception of Van Gogh as an artist who always painted before nature in a flash of emotional excess, his approach to the creative process was often more deliberate and controlled and conceptual than the popular stereotype suggests. When the repetitions are considered comprehensively, it becomes clear that his motives for painting them were varied and complex, often predetermined by specific strategies and circumstances. In many cases, he painted repetitions to improve or refine a composition. He also made them for practical reasons, to exchange with other artists, as an appreciative gift to a portrait sitter, to retain aversion to himself, to demonstrate his progress to others. After his mental breakdown in December 1888, Van Gogh discovered yet another reason for painting repetitions. This process could be a calming and consoling activity. That is, a recuperative strategy during periods of anxiety, illness, and depression. In February of 1890, shortly before his death, he acknowledged experiencing personal difficulties when painting from life. Quote, the emotions that take hold of me in the face of nature go as far as fainting. But here's the benefits, he wrote about, of working in the studio, quote, out of doors, exposed to the wind, the sun, people's curiosity, one works as one can. But when one returns to the studio to do a study time and again, you can order your brushworks. Certainly it produces something more harmonious and agreeable. What the repetitions definitively prove is that Van Gogh was not a madman who also painted, but he was instead a supremely gifted artist who occasionally suffered from mental and psychological ailments. Yet he remained capable of painting and drawing with incredible precision and control, and above all, who despite the vast amount of attention he has received, remains widely misunderstood. So thank you for coming and for your observations. I'm happy to respond to any questions or comments. Yes.
You indicated that Dr. Arnold had a peculiar experience what was wrong with Van Gogh. What was that?
Intermittent poria.
Intermittent polio?
Poria.
Oh.
Intermittent poria. I don't know. I would have to. It's an inherited metabolic disorder. I'm trying to remember what he said. Go ahead.
It's been suggested, as far as Van Gogh's health, that one, he had glaucoma, hence the circles around bright lights like in Starry, Starry Night and some of his other paintings.
Right.
And also that his mental condition was affected by lead poisoning as a result of his mixing his own colors. So what are your feelings about both of those?
So I'd probably discount both of them. I don't think first of all, I think you would actually have to drink the paints. And there's only one known example of him doing that. He did that once during a mental attack. But he didn't do it enough that I think led poisoning. I don't see any evidence of glaucoma. There's one other thing I didn't mention. So one of the things that was prescribed for him by his doctors was foxglove. And that was done for people to help with depression. Foxglove can cause hallucinations. So that's a possibility. But I think that mostly happened when he was under the care of Dr. Gachet during those last 70 days of his life.
No, I was going to ask, that's a very interesting talk. I was going to ask about the paints, actually. Well, did he use tube paints, or did he mix all his paints from regular pigments? And are any of these pigments likely to be harmed by X-rays?
Okay, he used tube paints. I mean, to paint outdoors, it would just be impractical to be hand mixing paints outdoors. What was the second part of?
Well, I was wondering if any of the pigments,
Thanks.
when you look at these things by X-ray,
Right.
we're always told, these things are UV sensitive. X-ray, of course, is even more powerful radiation. I was wondering if that actually is significant on any of the pigments.
I should ask our conservators to answer that question, but I believe that X-rays will not damage pigments. The one thing, the one thing I can tell you that's also not widely known about Van Gogh is that some of his pigments have faded.
That's right.
And that's the case, for example, with the bedroom. You see the blue areas? That was originally lavender. We have a really wonderful painting in the Cleveland Museum of Art called There's Popular Trees on a Hillside. It looks like it has a bluish background. It was really originally lavender. And you'll see some still lifes of Van Gogh that have white flowers. They were originally rose. And there are certain pigments that Van Gogh used that are fugitive, and mostly these reds, and it was the reds mixed with blue that made the color lavender, and since the reds have faded, they've turned to this bluish color. I hope I'm...
I have another quick question.
Yeah.
When he did these repetitions, I remember reading your catalog, it was very interesting. Did he do them just one after the other? Or did he basically do one and then go off and come back a month later and do another one? Do you know that?
Yes, I do. So sometimes he would do them in close succession, but not always. So for example, the bedroom that was painted in his room in Arles in October of 1888, he came back to that a year later while he was in the asylum and painted the other two. So it depends.
Other than Theo and maybe Gauguin, who else was Van Gogh close to?
One of the closest people was Toulouse-Lautrec. So when Van Gogh went to Paris, he worked in a private studio, and it's where he met many of these artists. The other connection was through his brother Theo. So Theo was an art dealer at Goupil, and his responsibility was the work of contemporary artists. So Theo did an exhibition of Monet's paintings. And if we went back and I showed you this painting that Van Gogh made when he first got to Arles, it's so much like Monet. So that was part of the connection. Toulouse-Lautrec was one of the artists who did visit Van Gogh in Arles, but he didn't stay there. So Gauguin was the only one who took up the invitation to live together and work together in a community. But Toulouse-Lautrec was someone who was very close to Van Gogh. And there were others, Émile Bernard. There's a small group of them. Yes, there's a question.
Yeah, I apologize if I missed this earlier, but your thesis is very convincing. Will it or has it resulted in a book?
Well, we did this catalog for the exhibition in 2014 that was at Cleveland and the Phillips Collection in Washington. Yes. There's been a fair amount written about that, yes. So I have to tell you that the symposium that we did was really, really interesting. And we talked more broadly about this association of artists, not just artists, but musicians, writers, even actors, and the association with suicide. And it's very strong and convincing. So, yes.
I was just curious, this may be a tangent, but did he do okay on the business side of art? Like, did he support himself through this, or was it family money?
No, Vincent, it's not true that he never sold a painting in his life, but he sold practically nothing. He could sell small drawings, but there's no way he could support himself, and so he was supported by his brother Theo. And I mentioned that was one of the reasons, I'm sure, for his suicide, that he felt that he was being, and Theo, by the way, had just gotten married, they had a young child, and Vincent felt that his brother could no longer support him because he had a new wife and baby.
Are the values of the various repetitions greater than the original, or is the original study in life more valuable?
The answer is no, and that's because most people don't, unless you're really reading in the subject, understand which are this first and which are the second versions. They don't use this word repetition sometimes. I will say one of the things that surprised me when we were in the course of this research project is how many of Van Gogh's paintings are questioned in their authorship. This is a huge issue with Van Gogh. I mean, some people say that there are more than 44 forgeries in the Catalogue Raisonné, the first important one. So, and what we also got into this issue of authorship and attribution. And what we found out is that sometimes the attribution of a painting would be questioned based upon its relationship in terms of aesthetic quality with another one. And what we discovered is that sometimes it was the first version that was painted quickly and, you know, he slashed it out, that has a different kind of aesthetic to it. And so we worked closely with the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and we tended to discount a lot of the works that have been questioned. Now, there's a very famous example, and that is the portrait of Dr. Paul Gachet. I wish I had images to show you, but there's one in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and there's one in a private collection. The one in the private collection is of significantly higher aesthetic quality than the Orsay version. And I'm pretty sure that I know why that is. I think, and this is kind of the opposite of what I was just mentioning before, I think he painted the first one of Gachet for himself, and I'm pretty sure that Gachet pressured Van Gogh to make a copy for him, and I think Vincent slashed that out quickly. And this is also true that one of the sunflowers was questioned for a while, but it's been pretty definitively concluded by the Van Gogh Museum that it's genuine. That's in the Yoshida. The value is based not so much on whether it's the first, second, or whatever version, it's based on differences in aesthetic quality. And that does occur with his work. Any other questions? Oh, I think we have one.
You mentioned that Van Gogh didn't sell many paintings when he was alive. When did he become so popular? When did that take off?
Well, so he began to get recognition finally in the last year of his life, actually just months before his death, when he exhibited some works in an exhibition in Brussels in January 1890, and critics responded to that very positively, and he got some good press, but mostly that was being circulated amongst art critics, you know, and fellow artists. And then it was with the publication of these letters and this story by Gauguin about 10 years later, and the whole thing about cutting his ear off and all of that. That's what really pushed his reputation to the attention of the broader public. So that began about 10 years after Van Gogh's death, which is actually quite extraordinary. But it happened very early.
So you talked about the article that was written about Van Gogh that really focused more on his painting rather than his mental health.
Right.
Did that have any significant feedback, or was it like well recognized at all by the community?
Yes, that's the article by Aurier that I was mentioning. That's the one that, you know, I think it's a brilliant article. Fabulous writing. He's a poet, right? Aurier. So anyway, that got the attention of fellow artists and critics. It's not something that the general public would have responded to necessarily, but it was the beginning of his kind of public, his emergence as an artist to a kind of community of critics and people who were really paying attention to what was happening in the art world.
Are Vincent's siblings, like one of his siblings, still alive or something?
No. He does have living descendants. In fact, one of them is a politician in the Netherlands, quite famous. So, but no. And I should probably clarify that. They're not directly his living descendants, they're living descendants of his siblings. Because he never had children. But of the Van Gogh family, there are Van Goghs alive.
A couple of years ago, I believe Columbus or Dayton had an exhibition, not so much of Van Gogh. They said that was just too expensive to bring those paintings to their museum, but of other artists that Van Gogh particularly liked and studied. Did you go to that exhibition, and if so, what did you think of it?
Unfortunately, I did not see that exhibition. There was recently a really wonderful exhibition in Detroit about Van Gogh in America. And they had worked for a long time on this show. They started out as a small show, and it grew and it grew and it grew over COVID because they had to cancel it and cancel it. It gave them extra time to work on it, and it turned out to be just a fabulous exhibition.
So it was Theo, his brother, who managed to save all his paintings and drawings, because usually when somebody's considered mad or insane,
right,
those things get
tossed. Yes, to a great extent. Theo's collection, which passed to his widow, Johanna, and then so she's in the Netherlands, and she's trying to increase his reputation. She's sending those paintings to exhibitions. She begins publishing the letters and finally a definitive volume of them. And that collection is the Van Gogh collection in Amsterdam today. So, but it's not the only place. So a lot of Vincent's artist friends had obtained works from him, often by exchange. Artists often exchange. So Gauguin had paintings by Van Gogh, and other artists did as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, William. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.